Schizophrenics of Reddit. What were the first signs of your break from reality, and how would you warn others for early detection? Hi y'all, it's Em here with another video. Please enjoy and have a spooktastic day. Story 1. My mother, father, and college roommate all had schizophrenia. In the case of both my mother and roommate, their first signs early on was hearing their name being called, and no one was there. More voices came from my mother, and eventually visuals. My roommate started feeling things on her, then delusions, and every possible kind of hallucination. I don't know what the first signs were for my father, but earlier delusions were that he thought he was on a game show and that he was being watched by the CIA. Edit, this was a quick post, so I'll add more here for clarity. First, my roommate was feeling touches and insects on her. The feeling of insects is probably common. She would also see spiders or flies. She had an unusually quick progression and would hallucinate demons, and sometimes flat out dissociate, and go into something like a bad acid trip involving demons. My mother is currently medicated, but still hears demons talking to her. She is highly religious now. She also, apparently, hears the voice of one of her previous miscarriages, which she says is comforting. During the day, she is very functional, but when she doesn't take medication, she gets bad, and her symptoms worsen at night. Voices tell her what to do, i.e. don't drink wine. It used to be much worse with her. When I was a kid, she told me she was talking to Jesus and a baby in the guest room, and Jesus said I would live forever. She would bring food to the attic because she thought someone was living in it. Once I went into her bathroom and saw she'd written in pencil all over the counters and walls, like in a movie. She told me she was moving to Brazil to find treasure. She told me my father would turn into a winged demon, fly around, and beat her. My father was mostly delusional, and he thought he was being watched by the government or aliens or anything. This was in common with my roommate, who thought she was being watched by government or alien satellites and would cover the windows with foil. My dad doesn't speak much about his symptoms, but has told me he remembers traveling through time to watch my mother get abused as a child, with the help of aliens. A lot of you wondered how I am. I'm okay. One risk factor was that my parents were pretty big cokeheads for a while, but at least my mother's symptoms started before all of that. As mentioned, she was also abused as a kid, so this could have contributed. I'm currently getting my PhD in genetics. I try not to think up too much about what motivates me to study this topic, other than an interest and talent in the field. Hey, OP, major props to you for trying to make the best out of a not-so-great situation and choosing to move your life forward in a positive direction. Schizophrenia can be a major challenge for people and those around them, and it seems like you've seen your fair share of people suffering with this throughout your lifetime. Best of luck towards finishing your PhD, and just remember to be hypervigilant. Story 2. One of my husband's good friends was never formally diagnosed, but we're almost certain he had some form of paranoid schizophrenia. He began to be very paranoid about anything when his symptoms first started. He believed in a lot of conspiracy theories, like crazy ones about aliens invading, and that a group of aliens from space were watching his every move. On one occasion, he and my husband had gone to a coffee shop together, and after about 45 minutes, the friends started to tense up and talked about how another man in the shop was a secret agent sent to spy on him. Instead of saying something like, "Nah man, everything's fine, you're overreacting," my husband grabbed his friend's hand and said, "Man, that sounds terrifying. Let's get out of here and go to another place where you'll feel more safe." I tear up a little bit just thinking about it. He was a completely normal guy until his symptoms started around age 23, with the exception of having some depression and probably being an alcoholic. He was an incredibly smart guy, but last year he killed himself. He'd been largely abandoned by his friends for being too weird, and he didn't have much going for him when he had to move back home with his parents. But I'll always remember how kind and compassionate my husband was to him in those last months. His parents were also not very helpful and kind of brushed off his weird mannerisms, and so they didn't try to get him help. My first indication that he'd become schizophrenic were his really cryptic Facebook posts that he'd make. They just seemed a little off. Nothing that would make you scream, "Oh my gosh, I think he's schizophrenic." They were just much different to things he'd normally post. It's interesting that Opie's husband's friend was really into conspiracy theories, as I feel that a lot of people nowadays, especially those on Facebook, share this same sentiment. I think that line of where things start to border into schizophrenia is unfortunately not too clear. So for a lot of people, they do not know when to start reaching out for help. My condolences to OP and their husband, although, for the loss of their friend. Story 3. Careful worrying too much about auditory or visual hallucinations, though. You can get both of these from something as simple as really bad sleep deprivation. I've been there, and while that's also pretty unhealthy, it's not as big of a concern as other issues. Also, I'd just like your eyes try to find faces and images, I think sometimes you can hear your voice in random noise. And here's a comment with their own story. Exactly. I used to work maintenance at a private school. I also worked a lot of unpaid overtime, as I had no spine and didn't value my own time. One week, the school was expecting a health inspection, fire safety inspection, and some big event on Saturday afternoon. So, I worked 12 hours on Wednesday to go over everything, especially in the kitchen, and make sure it looks good. Then I worked 15 hours on Thursday to make sure any stained ceiling tiles were changed, all exit bulbs were working, every closet was as clear and easy to walk in as possible, and several other things I wouldn't have to do if the staff there would. Never mind, this isn't about that. Friday, I worked 19 hours to do my usual crap, as well as setting everything up for the events over the next few days. I did not hardly sleep at all that week. On Friday night, I heard voices coming from other rooms, even though I was the only one there. I was locking up, checking, and making sure no one was left behind. I heard yelling and guttural sounds coming from the gym. As I walked the outside perimeter, checking each door to make sure it was locked, I was sure that an evil figure was watching me from inside. When I was inside, I heard the ceiling cracking above me. It wasn't a good night. The brain is certainly an interesting thing, and we don't even know the half of all of its intricacies and patterns. A lack of sleep can cause problems with visual processing, which is why a lot of people will report seeing shapes or faces when they're tired, simply because their brain is malfunctioning. Story 4. This sounds like a joke, but it's my real advice. If these shadow people acknowledge you, maybe see a doctor. Otherwise, just get some sleep. Edit. So, I have a million responses in my inbox, and it's freaking making me anxious. I won't be responding to any of them directly. Number 1, if you're concerned, see a doctor. I went to my general practitioner first, and he referred me to specialists. Number 2, the reason it's bad if they acknowledge you is because if you're just sleep deprived or mentally wonky, these shadow people tend to disappear when you focus on them, and don't appear to be up to any real funny business. Number 3, shadow people, what are they? Humanoids of questionable origin and intent, also made of shadows. Number 4, for the one guy who was offended, why? I'm describing symptoms. I love you though. Number 5, finally, no matter their cause, the shadow people can't hurt you. If they become overwhelming, I stand by my above advice and suggest trying to sleep it off. Story 5. I had a friend who started talking about a random new program he was working on Facebook. He was a cake decorator, so no one knew what he was talking about. Then he randomly posted things like F everyone. He had very angry posts, and then he would post a bunch of random numbers the next day. He kept saying he was working on the programs, and there were these numbers he found. After a few months of this, he disappeared on social media for a bit. Then he came back and said he'd been diagnosed with schizophrenia and was in treatment for it now. He also apologizes for telling everyone to F off. Edit, I did lose close contact with him, but only because I live in another state. I did talk to him a few years back, and he said he was taking medication for schizophrenia. He said he thought the FBI had him working on a program using the radio. He said he had pages and pages of numbers written down. He is still a Facebook friend, though. He posts the most gorgeous cakes. He is a perfectionist. It's interesting to me how schizophrenia is one of those mental illnesses or disorders that can begin later in life, and not just when someone is a child. So even the most calm-natured or down-to-earth people can begin to develop symptoms later in their lives. I'm happy your friend was able to get on medications and is able to resume their lives. Plus, their cakes sound honestly delicious. Story 6. Hard to say where it started. I was very isolated at the time. I was just very confused, I think. More than hallucinations, I saw meaning behind everything and every coincidence. What was that meaning? Didn't really know. Eventually just decided it was my brain telling me I'm schizophrenic, which I was very lucky to do. I went in for treatment of depression and was in the psych ward for 2 weeks. Then probably a month after that, I asked my doctor what was really wrong with me. It was pretty funny thinking back on it. I don't know how she didn't laugh in my face. Like, girl, you've been talking to yourself and thought the TV was communicating things to you? You're probably gonna get better answers from loved ones of schizophrenics, seeing as it's a coin toss, whether or not we have any insight at all. Story 7. He has not been diagnosed, but I firmly believe my husband is schizophrenic. I never noticed the early signs at the time, but looking back, he'd often get a really weird look in his face and ask if I'd heard that. I always just thought he was being silly, so I'd laugh and say no. Then it began to happen with visuals too. He'd start to get really freaked out and I asked what was wrong, and he'd say, "Did you see that?" And I'd say no, and he tried to play it off like he'd just been joking. Eventually, he'd start having complete breaks from reality, usually after the sun would go down. He'd act kind of off during the day, and I knew what was coming that night. As for early detection, it's kind of hard to say. I guess if you're hearing or seeing things you know aren't there, or others aren't seeing that, might be a good indicator. Sounds like sundowning, which is when people start to have worse symptoms or agitation after dark. This is much more typical with older folks, though, who have dementia or Alzheimer's, but it can also be seen in people with mental illnesses. I hope, OP, that you're able to get your husband some help soon. Story 8. For myself, it was messages from Nemesis, the Greek goddess. Was convinced I was her chosen one and to follow her. Also was constantly seeing shadow people and images constantly surrounding me, and hearing my name called constantly, when not hearing Nemesis speaking to me. Went into therapy thinking I was bipolar, ended up finding out I was schizophrenic. Luckily on medication and doing better. Nowadays I struggle with the symptoms medicine can't help with, like anxiety and depression, and all the other symptoms. The antipsychotics can't target alone. Honestly, the stigma in having to explain to people why I am jobless despite being a father and husband is the worst part. Feel like a failure many times a day due to being disabled. Story 9. I started hearing songs on the radio and thinking I was being given secret messages by them. And here's a question asked OP. Any particular songs and messages? It would be interesting to know if there were any singers whose songs correlated with a certain subject. I don't want to give away too many personal details, but there are a lot of songs on the radio. I can't remember them all, but I'd wager at least half a dozen artists. I thought I had a special relationship with the singer of a particular band, and thought one of their albums was a roadmap for how I was supposed to behave. Each song in chronological order described various states and actions I should be taking in my life. Story 10. The first sign was that I can hear people from the other side of the roads or in other rooms, loud and clear. But instead of just whispering about their own conversation, I hear them talk about me, planning to do things to me. Any sounds and not being loud enough volume for me to hear clearly turns into a murder plot. The second sign was feeling bugs crawling on me at all times. Of course, when I look, there are no bugs there, and the feelings go away. But this often keeps me up at night. I was convinced there were thousands of insects at all times on my skin. The third sign was the need to run away. I skip town to town because I have a bad feeling about it. Paranoia, anger, everyone is against me. I'm really sorry to hear that you went through all that, OP. It can be really scary when our own brains start to play tricks on us, as it leaves us lost as to what to believe. Story 11. Not schizophrenic, but bipolar, which has led to psychosis. For me, it started with derealization and depersonalization, and escalated from there. I wasn't real, and the world wasn't real. Led to seeing spiders all over the walls and thinking that aliens were trying to kill me, and I had to kill them first. A friend was concerned and had the police do a welfare check, and I tried to stab the cop with a large knife because I thought he was an alien. That shit is scary. Once they got me into the hospital and got me some treatment, I did much better. I'm actually off all my meds now and doing pretty good as far as my delusions, but my life is also in a much better place. There is hope. Story 12. As someone who has schizophrenia, reading all of the comments on this thread made me feel about 5,000 times less alone than usual. That being said, for me, it was thinking that all my friends were plotting against me. So much so that I started digging as hard as I could to find as much dirt on everyone as possible. Auditory hallucinations followed that pretty quickly. At its worst, I began misremembering important life events, only to find out years later that what I felt I so vividly remembered to be true was actually not. But I guess that's psychosis for you. Meds, therapy, and a fiancé and friends who have your back all work wonders, though. They don't judge me when things get rough. Honestly, a good support system is sometimes the best treatment. Just good people who are always ready to sit and be there with you when things start to get rough. I'm really happy things are going better for you, OP, and thank you for sharing your story with us. Story 13. Diagnosed schizoaffective bipolar here. Basically, I have both schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. It started when I was 5 years old. I would see dead people, feel the presence of ghosts, smell rust and metals, hear voices and thoughts of other people. As a teenager, I thought I was a psychic. As an adult, I started a job as a psychic medium. I legit thought I could predict the future. One day I just decided I'm freaking crazy and got a psych eval. Been on medication ever since and super grounded. My major triggers are fourth wall breaking video games and TV shows. The Truman Show is also terrifying for me. Story 14. First thing was hearing voices of people I knew calling my name when they couldn't possibly be there. Like, I would hear a family member or friend that lives 3 hours away by car. Then I started seeing objects, often while driving. Once on a lonely Nebraska night on Highway 2, a giant radio tower suddenly appeared in front of me in the road, and then dissipated when I drove through it. I also see silhouettes of people occasionally. Worst visual I've gotten was a very real-looking man try to break into my house during the day, and it freaked me the F out. Happened twice. Edit, also blood-curdling screaming. Story 15. It started with not needing to sleep as much. Countless days of being awake. Driving endlessly to pointless destinations, disregarding police authority. And here's a question towards OP. Was it disregarding because you felt that they had no authority or that you felt it was inconsequential? It was more of a feeling that I was above the law and the police were hindering me from accomplishing my goals. Story 16. I thought I was an alien descended to Earth to assist in saving humanity, 'cause a picture fell out of a book. I thought if I killed myself, I could escape this realm and be back with my extraterrestrial family, the only place I belonged in silence. It was like I could hear 1,000 different TV news broadcasts at once. I was always being followed by a dark force. I'm okay now. Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.